welcome. We are very honored to have with us Richard Fuller. And he is an engineer, entrepreneur, and environmentalist. That's why how he describes, I believe, yourself in the Pure Earth website, which is the Pure Earth is the organization, it's a public health organization that he founded in 1999, so now more than 20 years. And Pure Earth is it's really interesting organization, the way it works, making sure that there's real public health action in very important environmental topics, partnering with governments, communities, and industry leaders to identify and implement solutions that stop toxic exposures, protect health, and restore environments, with a focus on lead and mercury, which have been the key toxic elements that they have been focusing on. So we are very lucky to have Richard with us. So thank you so much. And we are looking forward to the presentation and discussion that we hope to have all of us together.
Thank you, Anna. Nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. And folk online, nice to see you too through this little machine. I'm really glad to be here and talk about lead with you because it's recently hit the high time. It's become a cause celeb. Jill Biden stood up in front of about 300 of us and said, lead is a priority for my administration and the government moving forward. And along with her was the head of the World Bank, the head of UNICEF, the head of WHO, Tedros was there, head of UN Environment Program, and 4 or 5 presidents and prime ministers from all around the world who were there. So it's been extraordinary to see how all of the work we've been doing over the past 20 years has ended up generating this amount of energy over time. And a lot of it is because of research and programs that we've done in low and middle income countries, because the attention is now all on low and middle income countries. So what I want to do here is, if I can make this work, there'll be this button here. Can we get rid of the lead? This okay? Just click okay. Great.
There you go.
There we go. What I want to do is to go through a few things with you. First, I want to talk about some of the new research that's going on in the last 12 months. It's building on a paper that I assume everyone has already absorbed thoroughly, maybe not Lex, but he will soon, in New England Journal that Anna Navas just published, a week ago, with Bruce Lanphier and David Bellinger, yeah. So it's pretty great. So I want to talk about some of the new research that builds from there and onwards, mostly about exposures in LMICs and programs and projects to be able to reduce it. I'll talk a bit about this partnership for a lead-free future. It's very difficult to say. But I think most of you might be more interested in, now that there's a lot of energy around lead, where might you focus your research activities? Am I right in thinking that might be something you'd all be particularly interested in? Yeah, it's good. Okay, so that's what I'll do. So do all of you know Pure Earth yet? Is there anyone who doesn't know much about Pure Earth?
Many people don't know.
Great. Okay. So we've been around for 25 years. We're a nonprofit that's housed in the God Box, just across from Columbia University, 475 Riverside Drive. We're about 100 now. We'll soon be 150 or 200 people. And most of our work is in India, Bangladesh, Mexico, Ghana, Tanzania, the Philippines, and so on. There's about a dozen countries that we have staff in place, sometimes embedded within the government, and always doing projects to reduce BLLs. So our purpose in life, aside from our work on mercury, which is about 15% of our budget, our purpose in life is to reduce BLLs at scale in countries that are significantly affected. So we do this in a very collaborative framework. We work with UN and WHO and all the rest of it, but we're very embedded and working closely with ministries of environment, ministries of health, who are much more affected, by the way, than ministries of environment, in country and designing projects and helping them move along. So we are getting a lot of new grants at the moment from the work that's been announced, and we'll be growing pretty fast, which is really great. I'm in charge. I founded the organization. I just stepped down as CEO and gave over to the younger generation. I'm too old to manage a couple of hundred people. I couldn't bear it, to be honest. So people who do are very brave and younger. And I'm now in charge of research and strategy. So looking forward to see where and how we can reduce the VLLs at scale around the world. So I don't think I need to describe the impact that lead has out there. Anna's paper says it better than all of this. But we all know that it's a horror show, and right now it's declared by IHME to kill 3.5 million people. This is people who had lead earlier in their lives who now have cardiovascular disease. And World Bank says that number is 5.5 million. So it makes it of the same scale of impact as air pollution. So no one knows that clearly at the moment, I think, but when you think about lead, you really want to be saying it's causing as much harm as air pollution is. And in a different way. One is that it causes, obviously, health impact directly. You have cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and the rest of it. But the damage to cerebral development early on means you have a less intelligent population. And the implications for that are really quite extraordinary. That it means lower productivity and lower entrepreneurship. And just in general, we ought not to have that happen for obvious reasons, many of which we should not even begin to explain at the moment, this week, last week. What we know about lead, we've always been trying to put into this particular URL, the science there, the World Bank's data set, the data sets from IHME. If you ever need to know what we know about lead levels and populations exposed and also sources, this URL is really useful too. So I just want to throw it up there as a good resource for you all. And you can download big data sets from it all and the rest of it. So let me go into a couple of things that you may already know that Anna has been working on for many, many years with Tony Lamas and others. First is that lead causes cardiovascular disease. It, over a period of time, has two separate mechanisms, one where it creates a hardening of arteries and another where it creates more material within the arteries to form. And both of them are independent, but both of them can cause you to have an infarct or for you to have a stroke. So the amount to which the total cardiovascular burden in the world has been attributed for lead has traditionally been very low because these relationships have not really been very well understood. The World Bank, in their analysis, said it's closer to 5 million deaths, and IHME just put out their 2023 numbers at 3.5 million deaths. So it's an enormous and significant issue. It's more than smoking. So did you all know that the environmental problems you had are actually a bigger problem than smoking? Or maybe you're doing smoking here as well. You do smoking, yes. So because of that, there's a lot more attention now at the policy level to dealing with lead. And the big thing, I think, is this paper that Tony Lamas and Anna Navas put out in the Journal of the American Heart Association, saying it is a problem. And that hasn't yet rippled into the cardiovascular community. But at some point, if there are the right kind of tests available, easy to do, I think there's a chance that when you go in to see your cardiologist, which I have to do every year these days, they'll take a cholesterol test, they'll check your diet, and they'll check your lead level. And that doesn't seem an unreasonable extension of what's been going on as we become more and more clear about the cardiovascular impact. I was talking with Anna about some analysis that some of you might be involved in to see if an adult who has a short-term exposure to lead, and you could have that, by the way, by going to Mexico and eating out a bunch of guacamole and bringing home a nice bowl and using it, maybe it's a coffee mug and using it to drink coffee. And you would get a short-term high burst of lead because the glaze in much of the Mexican pottery is made with 65% lead. The formula is basically galena melted and then put in as a glaze. So that short-term exposure most likely gives you an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But similarly, if you take that risk away, if you realize it and you take it away, then your cardiovascular risk, we think, probably declines. So there are these kind of issues at stake that I think will change the way that doctors and cardiologists view things as time goes on. So let me switch channels for just a second and talk about the rest of the chemicals agenda, because we've all become now focused on PFAS, and before that we were focused on endocrine disruptors or PCBs or whatever else it might have been. How does lead stack up amongst all of these other toxins? There is no IHME like burden of disease for chemicals outside of lead at the moment for a global assessment of how much impact they have. But we can get around this, at least indicatively, by going out and asking a set of experts for their expert judgment on all of this. And there's a very lovely way of doing this using structured expert judgment. Anyone familiar with structured expert judgment as a methodology? It's totally cool. You choose your dozen experts, and then you get ready with a bunch of questions you're going to ask. In this case was, how many people do you say die from asbestos, arsenic, blah, blah, blah. I'll go through these in a second. That's the questions you want to ask. But you need to know whether they're any good as experts. So you set up, first of all, a bunch of questions that they should know the answers to because they're already in the literature. When you get them on the Zoom, ready to go through and have them fill in their forms, you first ask them these calibration questions and record those answers. And then the software behind the structured expert methodology takes the calibration questions and reduces the value of the actual answer to the question, depending on how well they answer the calibration. So if they don't get the calibration questions right, then the value for their answer in the final result will be rather small. Whereas people who do get them right, their value will be counted much higher. Very smart, very clever way of doing it. It beats the way that has been used traditionally with experts, which is called BOGSAT. This is another thing rather than structured expert judgment. BOGSAT's the traditional way we look at experts. It stands for bunch of guys sitting around a table. So BOGSAT tends to get the loudest voice with that number. BOGSAT's the way that IPCC does their estimates, by the way, their projections. SEJ means you can be a little more interesting about it all. Nevertheless, we went through this, and here is asbestos at around 600,000 deaths, arsenic at, I think, 250,000, benzene, nothing, cadmium low. We think this is wrong. We think cadmium is more like maybe 400,000 or 500,000. Chromium at 100,000, dioxins at nothing, fluoride at almost nothing. Highly hazardous pesticides at 200,000 or 300,000. Lead came in here at almost 1.75 million deaths, which is before this is all done before the World Bank paper and the revisions to IHME come out. And mercury at 100,000, PAHs at 100,000, polychlorinated PCBs, almost nothing. PFAS, almost nothing. Phthalates, almost nothing. EDCs, brominated flame retardants. So a lot of the things that are traditionally worked on in academic institutions and are the aggressive issues that are put forward within regulatory agencies and within the international communities aren't significant causes of mortality or morbidity. There's a similar chart for morbidity, doesn't show anything particularly different. And instead, we've forgotten about the things that do cause most of the damage out there in the world. Lead has really been mostly forgotten outside of the US. It's absolutely forgotten in Europe. Any of you have European roots, there is almost zero work going on lead. There is work on highly hazardous pesticides at a global level, and they are significant, and mercury to a lesser extent. But we don't worry about arsenic, about cadmium, asbestos, many other things that cause large levels of mortality and morbidity are just not on the table. That's an opportunity for you all. Thanks.
Do you mind if I make a quick comment?
Love to.
So a few years ago, Anna and I, we prepared a big proposal to the MacArthur Foundation, which didn't get funded. And we came up with the premature deaths, a number for Bangladesh because of arsenic. And it was a couple of 100,000. So my point is that the arsenic peak reflects one country, Bangladesh, in this assessment.
Yeah, good point. And
So I think it's
yeah,
underestimated.
so I think this is probably underestimated. I think this is not meant to be, perfect here. This is meant to be just what the experts did on aggregate.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't be at all surprised if overall arsenic might be 600,000 or 700,000 globally, because it is significant in Bangladesh and 2 or 3 other areas in the world. I think that it's reasonably significant. So there are issues here, but it's still the main point that I'm putting across, that we all work on things that get funded. The governments tell us what to fund, what to work on, and that's wrong. We're doing it wrong. We ought to be working on arsenic, and MacArthur should have funded it. So lead is a big deal, and most of the impact for lead is in low and middle income countries. If we go back to that lead and pollution map, average blood lead levels in the US are less than 1 microgram per deciliter, just under it. And they've been falling steadily since we got lead out of gasoline. Yay. In LMICs, that didn't happen. They took lead out of gasoline, often quite in a similar time frame as it came out in the US. But they started at 10, as we had here in the US, and they came down to 7 or 6, and then they stopped there, and they haven't come down any further. What the heck? Why? Because, with all lead in gasoline. The answer is there's lead from other sources in low and middle income countries. One source that we all talk about is industry, and mostly that's around car battery recycling. So when we look at those particular sites where people are nearby to a car battery smelter, where they rip the battery apart and then take the innards and then smelt them to make lead for another car battery, there's a lot of emissions that are lost to the environment. If you don't have a very well-financed and well-run facility, you can poison a lot of people around the facility. And I would bet that many people here have been involved in studies around those particular sites. But if you add up the number of people and the number of sites, it doesn't still get you anywhere near to the amount of lead poisoning that we're finding when we see an average for the whole country at 5 or 6 micrograms. It's really only about 10% of the total lead burden comes from these contaminated sites. So it's something else. So what else could it be? So we did a study. It took us 4 years, funded by Open Philanthropy, to look at leaded products in the household in LMICs. And there's a lot of them. So paint is a problem in almost every country. It may not be an immediate risk because a lot of it's newer paint rather than the stuff that we had here from the 1930s that's flaking off. Ceramic foodware, I talked about the Mexican pots. They're everywhere and made from leaded clays. Turkey, by the way, if you've got a Turkish plate, beautiful Turkish plate. I tested a bunch of people in Switzerland who had been to Turkey and brought back these incredibly beautiful plates. They're all made of lead, and they're all bioavailable lead as well. Cosmetics. The cosmetic that we worry about is called kohl or surma. And it's a a liner that people will put on their children's eyes, right above the eyelash and right underneath the eyelash. And it gets into the liquid in the eye, or the children touch it and put it in their mouths and they get lead poisoning from it. And that seems to be a very Muslim problem that is in so many more places than I expected. The stuff is made from lead as well, 60% lead traditionally. There's a little bit of toys, but it's much less than this makes out, because this was just things that had a positive for lead. But toys, you have to eat it in order for you to have an increased blood level. This was just the prevalence of a product that had some lead in it. So you can't imagine kids eating all of these products so much. So I don't think the prevalence is so high. Similarly with plastic food, where again, it's not going to be a large increase. And spices, you've all heard about turmeric being contaminated with lead. Is that something you've all heard about? So this is only in about 6 countries around the world, and all but 3 of them now have really dealt with it. It's just a handful of people who buy bulk turmeric and grind it, and it's not yellow enough for them to be able to sell it well on the market. So they add lead chromate to it, and in doing so, they poison other people who buy it. So we think perhaps this accounts for the balance of lead exposures that are out there in low and middle income countries, aside from contaminated sites. But we're not 100% sure. We're not even like 80% sure, to be honest. It might be like 60% sure. And there could easily be more places and products out there with these products in it. So here are some pictures of some of those products. You could see for a second, this is the kohl or the surma around the eyes. This is aluminum cook pots. This is actually in Ghana, often made very locally. People will have their name in metal in the plates, and they'll give them to a married couple as their daily cooking pot. Here's a ceramic from Mexico. That's the kind of ceramic that you want to be wary of. They can have many colors on them as well, but it's this lovely clay. That's the reason that it becomes bioavailable is because it's baked at a low temperature. So if it was a higher temperature, the lead would be bonded into the glaze and would not come out in the presence of food, in the presence of acid or heat. But the low temperature kind of pottery is what makes it happen. And here, of course, are turmeric and other spices. Ayurvedics. There's a whole set of Ayurvedics that have lead in them, or just simply are lead for different purposes. So be wary of that as well. And by the way, some of these are available on Amazon or on TikTok or even in stores. This is the pot that in Amazon in the UK costs £25, and so on. So there's a lot of these things are available in the US. And in fact, this brings me to an area that I think might be incredibly ripe for the Columbia team to take on, perhaps, which is that it's quite possible that these products come into the US through people who are emigrating. Come on in, come and grab a seat. There's one here if you want. It could come in through the immigrant population, could come in from people on vacation. The immigrant population might open a small store and start importing stuff from his cousin and selling it, broadly without really worrying about regulations. But these products we're finding are potentially more significant in terms of US exposure than pipes. So if that proves to be true, if you all did a study that showed that, then the US government would put billions of dollars into stopping these exposures in LMICs, and you could potentially save millions of people from premature death. So the opportunity, if we can prove this to be true, is fantastic. The indication that we know that this might be true is a small study, not that small actually, but it was done in 4 different jurisdictions. Kings County, Washington, which is basically Seattle. New York City, all of Oregon, and California. And there, what we did was we went into the records of the government officials who had gone into people's houses because a kid tested above 5 micrograms. So when a kid tests above 5 micrograms in many states, it triggers a response where the government goes in and tries to find what the source is and provides education to the parents. And they're expecting mostly that it's leaded paint that needs to be mitigated. But in many cases, it's some of these other products. So we went in and tried to work out how much was it these other products. So the other products is the red, and the paint is the blue. And you can see that, you know, the gray, by the way, is stuff that was uncertain, or it could have been both. But you can see here that the red is as strong as the blue in many cases. So the early indication here is that there is a lot of this, and maybe it's not bigger than water, maybe it's bigger than paint. And so how crazy would it be to find that out?
Richard, can I ask you a question about this figure?
Yes.
So in this case, this percentage is not the percent of the blood level, right? It's the number of items that were checked, and it's that proportion, is that right? Because whether the paint, which is there often in New York City, is a contributor, that's still a different question. Is that a fair question?
So the number is, when you look at the evaluation report done by the investigator, was the thing that they found, because they're usually going in with an XRF, okay? Did they find leaded paint? So then it goes in leaded paint. Did they find a piece of pottery that was high or whatever else? So if it was only a piece of pottery, then it would go into the red. If it was only paint, it would go in here. If it was both, it would go into this. So that's the best we could deal with in the data that was there. So we need a much better data set and a much better analytical technique. And then some really cool epidemiological methodologies to extrapolate from what will be things that are basically in certain communities, but working out how much they might apply at a national level. And then I think if all that works, we might have a real shift in government policy issue. This was very, very heavily peer reviewed by EHP. It went through 12 reviewers eventually, because they knew this was like something that was significant. Parameter has been there for a long time saying, I found this in a product. Great, but this says, no, it's not only there, it's actually as big as paint. And that was kind of scary for them all to have that. But we made sure it went into EHP. So anyone have any other questions about some of those things, the burden of disease or or this issue with potential exposures here? Anyone online have any questions? Because I'll switch now. How much time have I got? I've got plenty of time. Yeah. So I already talked a little bit about how this event at UN General Assembly this year really put the issue out into the public fore. $150 million was pledged. 105 of that comes from one organization called Open Philanthropy. Open Philanthropy is a charitable organization funded by Dustin Moskowitz and his wife. He was number 2 at Facebook. He's kicked out of Facebook. He's worth 32 something billion dollars. He's funded his charity with, it's now, I think, number 3 charity in the world. It's larger than Ford and larger than Rockefeller. So, and they are very much focused on effective altruism. Now, this is a way of evaluating what impact their philanthropy would have. And they have several different areas where they focus. The most significant is in public health. So DALYs and premature deaths are high in their focus. And the fact that lead has such high numbers in this makes it very, very interesting for them. So they're looking to make investments in things that they can measure and say, we took this number of people and we reduced their burden of disease by X amount. And when we do the analysis for some of the interventions that we've been involved with, they're quite spectacular. You can save one premature death for less than $100 in many of these circumstances. Their threshold is spending to put bed nets and have people not get malaria and die. And that number is around 2,200. So they want things that are less than 2,200. So we, the whole of the lead program fits in there incredibly well. They don't fund research. Now, we always carve a bit of money out to do our own research, and I'll show you what that looks like. But people are following behind this, and that 100 million that they put in, I'm sure will grow to be much, much, much more as other people in this space kind of move into it. So what they're funding right now is programs in countries, and the biggest group they're funding is ours, as you could imagine, where there's really only a couple of NGOs who are active in this space. The second largest is a group called LEAP, which stands for lead and something, 2 or 3 other letters, lead, environment, something. And they're doing leaded paint in about 20 countries. They're wonderful. They're based in the UK. So they're getting substantial monies as well. So what they're funding right now is a lot of work where we go into a country and we try to work out what is the actual average blood lead level and where are the concentrations at high BLLs. For that, you need to do a decent blood lead survey, usually up to 2,000 to 4,000 people, and do it in a blinded way, so a random kind of way. And at the same time as doing that, you need to go into people's houses and evaluate what sources are actually causing elevated blood lead levels, because it really varies substantially from country to country. So in Mexico, I would say 70% of it is from this pottery. But in Bangladesh, the spices were a significant part. They're about 25%. And the aluminum cookware is likely to be another high piece as well. I don't think I talked about aluminum cookware, but the traditional cooking pot that everyone uses is made with scrap aluminium. So I can switch from American to British in just one sentence. So the scrap aluminum ends up getting contaminated with pieces of lead that are around, just around the shop, because they're often made in pretty dirty environments, or they're made with car wheels, for example, which have those little leaded weights on them, or they're made from car radiators. That's an aluminium piece as well, and there's a lot of solder that's lead on it. So most recycled aluminium has around 0.5 to 0.8% lead in it right now. At those levels, what happens is, obviously aluminium melts at and then congeals at a much lower temperature. So the lead ends up in these little tiny dots within the aluminium. And when you look at a cross section of a pot, it looks like little sesame seeds dotted all the way through that are the aluminium spots. And as the pot wears, and aluminium wears quickly, then these little spots open up and give you a burst of lead into the food. So you'll find these pots don't have a very regular level of lead in them, but every now and then you'll find quite a high level of lead, and then you might test it again, might have a lower level of lead. So they could be a significant overall burden of disease in this, because they are ubiquitous. No one uses cast iron. Aluminium is much cheaper, much more easy to use, and the rest of it. So let me talk about what we're doing at Pure Earth. Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, maybe now is not the right time. I've been a bit slow, but it feels like, am I correct in thinking that sort of the high prevalence of these sort of diffuse sources in especially low income countries means that lead exposure is not as skewed in sort of like the lower income populations in those countries,
Yes.
the way that we're used to thinking in the US, for example?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And when we look in Mexico, for example, there is a slightly larger lump for low income people, because they're using these pots every day. They're the cheapest pots. But high-income people, they will eat off a Chinese, non-leaded plate, but they're going out to a restaurant 3 or 4 times a week. So all the restaurants have these pots because it's that traditional kind of pot. So if you're eating out that often, then you'll get a burst of lead as well. So, and I think the same is true for some of the eyewear, and the same is true for the aluminium cookware. Because, if someone's preparing your food, they're still going to be cooking in the aluminium pots. Maybe that you go stainless steel when you're at a certain income level. But I think it's much more than we see in the US for sure.
And I guess is that something that's coming out of these also more comprehensive representative surveys that are happening? Like this kind of question on the distributional.
We haven't, we've done 4 of these studies so far, and 2 of them have been published. There is a question in the study on household income. We haven't actually studied that point, so it would be an interesting study point to see how different it is in different
Be
countries.
the economist in the room.
I understand. That's a good question. It's a really interesting question. I think the data is there to be able to find that out. Yeah. All right. So any more questions? Anything else? Because I'll just talk about what we're doing, and then I'll talk about where I can see opportunities for more research to be done. But we're doing a lot of research to work out how much aluminium is causing exposure. We're looking at leaching tests. Lex has been involved in a lot of this work. We're looking at different kinds of leaching. We're looking at different kinds of food in these pots to see if we can work out what an overall burden of disease. And along with a gentleman called Howard Hugh, who you may know is another big lead guy, there's a small paper coming out quite soon that creates a metric called cumulative BLLs, sometimes cumulative population BLLs. And that's simply the average blood lead level multiplied by the size of the population. And so if you do take that number, you can set up a priority just simply to reduce cumulative BLLs rather than, and this is the way to prioritize, because you could say, if I spend $1 million and I reduce 1 BLL for 100 million people, I will have gotten 100 million CBLLs for $1 million. If I would have spent $1 million for a population of 1,000 people around a blood lead, around a battery smelter, I would spend $1 million and I would reduce their blood levels from 60 micrograms down to 50 BLLs over 1,000 people. It's 50,000 CBLLs. The funders will all want to go to the first because the impact is so much higher, because it's generally a linear relationship between 0 and 10 micrograms per deciliter with respect to either cardiovascular impact or intellectual impairment. So the CBLL is a way to then prioritize, and governments are going to start to use this as well as it goes. So when we're looking at impact, we're trying to put everything into a CBLL kind of process. So we'll do studies to say how much does the eyeliner affect the whole world, and we'll try to add up how many people in total and what the amount of BLL increase goes on from that eyeliner, and we can see whether it's a big deal or a little deal. And this is kind of where I think most of our work is going to go. So we're doing work on ceramics in a similar way, especially with testing and the rest of it. And most of this that I'm talking about feeds into quite a nice model we've built called the lead impact model, which breaks down by country and within country as well. How many people are impacted? What's the CBLL? And what's the profile of different sources, so that we can, help governments to choose what particular interventions they should do. Question in the chat.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, so on that last example, the effect of being up at 60 is very, and then changing to 10, you equate equivalently to the effect of going from 6 to 5. And
No.
yet,
For people.
Yeah, it's more people. You're absolutely going to have a much higher impact from 60 down to 10 for that population. It's an enormous impact in their well-being than we would for the larger population. So, and in fact, choosing going from 60 to 10 was probably wrong. I should have said from 10 down to 2,
Yeah.
right? Because there it's linear. But the point is, if you can spend more money and impact more people, then that's a better intervention. Make sense, Steve?
Yeah, no, it was the extreme example you gave that I
Yeah.
objected
It's
to.
tricky because if we know there are people affected like that, even though the impact is not as large, as a public health responsibility.
There's
and
an
ethical,
imperative.
it's an obligation
Yeah,
and imperative to do that. That to me, then I start forgetting about the numbers because I really care about these people at risk. The risk is so high that the numbers don't matter anymore. That's the way I think.
I do agree with that entirely. And in fact, if we were just to follow a CBLL methodology, much of the work in contaminated sites would not have the right calculation around it. You'd be interested to know that everyone agrees with Anna's assessment that we need to deal with things that are so acute. And the funding within the open fill budget, 20% of it is just for contaminated sites because of that. So again, those issues are critical.
So both are important.
They both are important, yeah. Lex.
Going back to the effective altruism and what Anna just said, if you really were to follow that, I think some people decide we should only think about the meteorites that hits the earth and not do any research on something else. So you have to be aware that you will get there if you don't watch out.
Yeah. Well, the meteorite hitting the earth has a very low probability. So overall, when you factor that in.
That's right, but that's why. But
Yeah.
and yet something else, like Anna tells you, this doesn't feel quite right.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, humans do that all the time, though. I mean, look at the tsunami, the amount of money spent on tsunami warning systems, and yet they happen infrequently.
Yeah. And their impact comparative to these public health crises is still somewhat low. You know, the number of deaths from hurricanes and tsunamis is not a very high number, but we fret about them. We fret about a shark attack more than we do about these things that cause millions of deaths. There's, I think, 20 shark attack deaths a year or 12 a year, some trivial kind of number. Yeah.
I guess, again, on this conversation, sort of from an economic standpoint, I wonder, like, do you think that also moving to this idea that sort of a lot of people are affected at relatively low levels, like, do you think that's also contributed to now putting this back in the spotlight, as in, like, again, like what happened in the 90s in the US? Like, it's not just a problem of sort of low-income people, it's a problem of middle-income people in the US. And now again, like this idea that, like virtually everyone in this room has been exposed to lead when we were kids.
Yeah, I think what's happened is a couple of things. First, the big thing is the realization that blood lead levels are so much higher in LMICs that no one was really aware of it, especially their own governments. So we've been working, pretty consistently over the last, 5, 6, 7 decades maybe 6 decades, to reduce blood lead levels as much as possible, and are spending large amounts of money on things that have quite small returns, but we're committed to this particular path of action. That hasn't happened in low and middle income countries at all. And so that's a bit of an eye awakening. The second thing that's happened is the rise of this effective altruism kind of thinking, and seeing that there can be such a cost-effective return in doing these interventions has meant that there's money coming into it. And once one big donor comes in, what I'm seeing now is that the other big donors say, "Oh, no, I was in there first. I did that," and then there's more money, and money keeps flowing. So it tends to compound. More thoughts? Because I want to go into a few ideas that may be of interest to you all. So I've broken these down into things that are related to work in the field or that are causing exposures, and then things that are related to looking at impact and analysis. So in the latter, there's more work to do on cardiovascular health. You know, the work that happened in chelation was interesting. It needs to go further. I don't see a problem with that actually moving ahead quite well. But this issue about LMIC products happening here in the US, this has enormous potential. And I really think that this is an idea that someone ought to pick up and do. We don't work in the US. We're only focused in countries and we're only focused on risk mitigation. But doing this will bring bazillions of dollars in to go and work over there. So I'm really keen that people do pick up this idea and do it. But if you're working overseas, and I put Lamont there because just thinking of you, Lex, here are some ideas. One of the big problems we see out there that's completely understudied is exposures in food. So we can see a whole set of studies, and we'll actually do a nice systematic review of this that will come out in the middle of next year, where we can see rice in various countries having sufficient lead in it to cause an elevation of 2 to 4 micrograms per deciliter. By the way, the way that we can say these things is we use UBEC, the US. Does anyone know what UBEC means? IEUBK. It's the Integrated Environmental Uptake Biokinetics, Kinetics, something like this. A US EPA model where you can calculate if you eat a certain amount of lead, how much your lead level will increase, or if there's a certain amount of dust on the floor and the kid is living with it, how much their lead level will increase as well. Very well studied. It's conservative, but it's been proven to be accurate over time. The bottom line is if you have 7 micrograms per day ingested for an adult, your blood level will raise by 1 microgram per deciliter. So 7 micrograms per day, that means if your rice, you eat about 150 grams of that per day. If you have more than about 4 micrograms per 100 grams of rice, you're going to have an elevated blood level. And that number shows up quite often in tests. It seems so small that people don't worry about it, but it's enough to elevate blood lead levels. Similarly, cassava, sweet potato, those also seem to bioaccumulate, and potato cultures in general seem to have more elevated blood lead levels because certain types of tubers are lead loving and they'll absorb lead. Similarly, certain kinds of leafy greens will pick up lead and store them. So there's some kinds of kale that take lead up in quite significant numbers. Lex, if you know more about this than me, you should take over because I'm only going from literature review, but others maybe have already studied this more than me.
The only concern there is how much is it because the food was not properly cleaned, right? So if
Exactly.
So I think the
Exactly.
soil level is critical.
The soil level is important, and then how it gets processed. The way that I think one should look at this, though, is to look at the food in the marketplace and see if it exceeds the threshold where it's causing, at least a half a microgram, 0.5 micrograms per deciliter. And then do a study on that rice or whatever it is, going all the way back through the food chain and see where the contamination has come. Is it an absorption issue or is it dust that's fallen on it? It might have been near a recycling plant and dust will fall on it. It might be in the processing machine that's milled it, where the gears have some leaded compound that is slowly coming off. All those things, but that I think is the way to do it. But I think needs to happen. So
I'm curious in terms of research opportunities, are you doing anything specific to looking at climate change relative to whether it increases the amount of lead in the environment or the extent of exposure?
we haven't, and there are some things that are actually interesting. The lead levels, for example, in downtown, the floods down the south where it flooded. Yes, thank you. the soil lead levels reduced significantly after that big last flood because it flushed a lot of the dirty soil out and took it out into the level. So there are some things where the lead levels may be reduced rather than increased from climate change.
I was thinking specifically, one of the things we see with rising carbon dioxide is an increase in carbonic acid and the reduction in methane. That happens for oceans, but it also happens for freshwater sources. If you have an infrastructure, particularly lead pipes, what's the effect of having a lower pH and the water flowing through those lead pipes with respect to lead exposure? Have you looked at that?
No, and the pH in pipes issue is so small that it probably wouldn't get on our radar to do anything about it because there's just the amount of lead exposure that's occurring from pipes, even domestically, is really small. The only issue with leaded pipes is actually during the period when you're changing pH. If you've changed it and it's held steady at a lower pH, my understanding is the pipes will eventually settle down to no longer flaking off little pieces and you don't have any more lead in the water. But look, it's an interesting thought. For me, I'm looking at large scale impacts. I'm looking at things that are causing large elevations and trying to work out whether there's something that we can mitigate and reduce. And the climate change equation, I don't know how it fits into that
I'll
particular.
offer one more idea for what
Please.
it's worth. If you're looking at food per se, and you're looking at food that is irrigated, and that irrigation is also being affected with respect to lowering pH and increasing lead levels within the soil. Is that something?
We haven't looked at that. That might be interesting. I mean, if there's a higher level of lead uptake because of some pH change or environmental change, that might increase it. But we first need to work out whether it's in the food or not. So I would start with that and then see whether there's some change in the food after that might occur because of that. I'll just tell you two more things, because I think people have to go pretty quickly. There's this one here, environmental exposure to BLL. We haven't got a decent study that says if you have paint on the walls, then after 10 years, you're 70% likely to have a increase of 5 micrograms per deciliter, or whatever the number is. There is no study like that. And it's all the data is there, but no one has done the study to say, here is what that exposure would occur. Similarly for other kinds of environmental exposures. Very difficult. We can do it now for things where you're eating it, the things where you're not eating it, the cosmetics, for example, skin absorption, these sort of things. There is no relationship between how much the environmental exposure is and the body burden for quite a large number of potential exposures. Very intellectually academic, interesting kind of problem that ought to be done. So when we're doing these analyses of looking at how much leaded paint there are on walls, we can't really say how much the BLL contribution is because there is no tool for that at the moment.
Transfer-based stochastic, right? So
It's stochastic, but you can say, at a stochastical level, here is an average level. That's the whole point of it all. Another thing that may be of interest to you is this ULAB issue. We talked about it a little bit, but trying to understand just how many of these locations and how many people are involved at an average blood lead level. This would be an enormous contribution. We've done some work ourselves on this. We mapped Ghana quite intensively and wrote a paper around how one country has contaminated sites like this, but it hasn't been done and expanded to other places, so we can have a reasonably good sense of it all. So there are a couple of interesting processes that go on. And there are programs going on in countries to measure baselines that are happening that are being well funded. So people who want to get involved in baseline BLL blood lead measurements, you really only have to put your hand in the air and someone will grab it rapidly, because there is a dearth of that information and a very strong need to do more and more of that kind of work. So I think these are ideas that we can talk about now as much as you want. I'll leave that up and we can talk about them all, but I am finished from what I had to say as well, and happy that we all got together.
Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and we can stay also for a little bit for those who are available. But I understand those who need to go. Feel free to do that. Questions, comments.
Was this something that you all basically knew already, most of you? No, it's interesting, yeah. Like the size of the impact and
Not in the
where it
global,
is.
I think in the global picture, it's something that we
Something
often
new.
miss.
yeah,
And from the research side, for us who are so NIH dependent, it has been really hard to get work funded related to lead. Because often reviewers will think this is no longer relevant. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's been really hard.
well, that's where this one, I think, is potentially an NIHS significant study.
Would the reviewers think it's no longer relevant in terms of research, not interesting research,
From-
or not relevant in terms of exposure?
I think a little bit both, from research for sure.
Infectious disease and
Yeah.
diarrhea or something, so
For
the whole
infectious
topic,
disease, it's an old topic.
even though it's not solved.
And from the exposure levels, the sense that there has been really quite a substantial reduction in the US, which is true. The declines, if you look at NHANES, have been really quite dramatic.
2.5% of the population is above 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. Kind of by definition of how they
Yeah.
it's marked.
But that number even it's keeps low, keeps going
Keeps coming
down,
down, that's right.
keeps coming down. And something I am really interested myself from the global perspective is to see how maybe rapidly we might be able to see change.
Mm.
Which I would not be surprised if we actually see it. And that may be why the investors, the people who are putting the money behind, they're excited about it. Because they can really see it have a big impact quickly. I say this, for instance, in Taiwan, until very recently, the levels were pretty high.
Mm.
But now I have a colleague there, he's a nephrologist, he was very interested about doing a study. And he tells me, wow, things have changed a lot
Mm.
in the last few years. So that's, it's really great.
Mm.
I think somehow we've become really good at, getting rid of lead. And I could see how many of the things that you are highlighting,
Mm.
I could see how they could change quickly.
Yeah,
Because people are smart. Now that
you
you're
never
being,
know, yeah.
if you let them know, they know that the spices, you made a huge impact with the spices. The aluminum cookware, like things could improve in terms of production, the quality. I think in Mexico, I know there's still issues going on, but people are working hard to replace the products.
The new
and-
president's actually talking to us.
Oh, wow,
So it's kind of wonderful.
Yeah.
She's on board and there'll be a whole set of new projects,
yeah.
happening over the next.
So,
year.
so I could see that in the next, 10 years,
This
we
is,
could
this
see
can be
a big
enormously
impact,
changed, yeah. I think
which
that's
would
possible.
be amazing.
Yeah. Huge results if it can happen.
So I guess from a policy standpoint, again, like, and building on this comment, like, it feels like, with the huge success you've had exactly in Bangladesh with the spices. Should we be going for interventions that are kind of at the regulatory side? As opposed to the things that are, at the household side?
Yeah. It's a super good question, and we model in that lead impact model. An intervention that has a regulatory component, and look at the cost per million CBLs. And the World Bank's publishing a paper around all of these things quite soon. And then we look at the cost if you had to do them through a public education kind of campaign, going from place to place and convincing them to change. And it's a 10 to 1 expense, sometimes 50 to 1 expense in terms of effectiveness. The problem though
Which
is,
direction, sorry,
yeah, the regulatory is much cheaper.
So if regulatory works, it's
Okay.
cheaper.
It works.
I just wanted to be
It
clear.
has to be cheap.
Right.
The cost for regulatory means first embedding a bunch of folk who are the regulators and buying them XRFs and giving them the training to go out and do all of the work and kind of helping them to set up. And then only doing that for 3 or 4 years and having it become part of the regular budget, which is not an unreasonable thing. It's happened in many other circumstances in public health. So that's not too bad. If you've got to do it site by site, place by place, it's very laborious. You have to have people go around and convince people and threaten them if they don't work and being convinced. And then have a local regulatory response if they don't do the right thing. And all of that's very slow and laborious. But in some types of exposures, that may be the only way to do it. If it's very poor local industry, village by village, there's one guy who makes the aluminum pots and he's gathering all the cans from around the community and using them in whatever car radiators he can. He is not going to listen to a regulatory guy. There isn't a chance of getting a regulatory guy out to see him because there's 10,000 of those in the country. So there's a need to do this. What we're trying to do for that particular issue, and we've got a smelter that we're using in India, the government-owned smelter that's doing this, is seeing if there's something they can throw into that mix when they're melting their aluminium that will pick up all of the lead and float it to the surface and they can skim it off. So it's a flux kind of question. And if they can do that, then the intervention is quite easy. It's going around and telling everyone, here, throw these in and use that because you'll stop poisoning people. I think that will be an easier intervention. Finding those interventions is still time. Any other more online, anyone?
Good. Wonderful. Those of you who would like to stay a little bit, please do so. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And please come and take coffee, boots, like